Welcome to Church Planting and Renewal Conversations as we begin a new season of webcasts. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and I serve M&A as Director of Ecosystem Development. Well, what happens when you have two church planters trying to make one good point? You end up with the 5 Points Church Planting Podcast. Well, for the past year, Hunter Brewer and John St. Martin have teamed up to discuss church planting from a Reformed perspective. So what we have here then is a webcast talking about a podcast. While at first blush, that may all sound a tad circular, the reason is simple. Much of our conversations here have been listening to specific planters describe their personal experiences, hearing from network coordinators as to the activities in their regions, or discussions with movement leaders with respect to trends. Well, today we're going to hear from two planting practitioners who have listened to others so that we can get a better overview of what is going on in our church planting circles. And so I'd like to introduce today the two guests that we have. We have Hunter Brewer. Hunter is the founding and former senior past minister of Madison Heights Church in the suburb of Jackson, Mississippi. He helped start the first and was the first coordinator of the Mid-South Church Planting Network, which covers Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Western Tennessee. He is now the planting pastor of Trinity Church in Collierville, Tennessee, a suburb of Memphis. He's married and has 2 kids. John St. Martin has served as the planting pastor of Resurrection Church in Fargo, North Dakota since 2018. And he is married with 3 kids. Well, before we jump in, as we always do, want to say this is a conversation. And so I want to invite you to ask questions, use the chat box, the Q&A feature as well. If you're watching on Facebook, it's always a challenge for us to track those questions, but we'll do our best. Please throw us some questions and perhaps situations to discuss. Well, guys, let's just start off talking about you as planters. But why did you ever decide to be a planter, and why would you ever want to do it a second time?
You go ahead first, Hunter.
Sure, no problem. So, Chris, I was mentored by a gentleman that planted 3 churches in the PCA, and he just infected me with the church planting virus. He was very passionate about church multiplication. He loved it. He was excited about planting. Ultimately, when I went to start Madison Heights, he came and served with me. He was, in his early 70s at that point, but he was wonderful. And the flip side to that is he never told me that it was hard. He never told me that it was difficult. He never shared with me the challenges. So I think on some level he duped me into church planting, but I'm thankful for it. I'm very grateful for his influence and how he led me in this direction.
Yeah, my introduction to the PCA was kind of in a church plant type situation. And so that was my paradigm for pastoral ministry, small church, kind of growing, trying to figure out what it means to grow a church in a college town specifically. And when I went off to seminary, if you went to Covenant Seminary prior to Dr. Douglas's retirement, you know that his prophetic powers to call all students to church planting was certainly instrumental in my time there. So kind of got on the church planting track, was excited about the possibility of, reaching those who are outside of the church, and was really sold on the vision that church planting is one of the greatest strategic ways to do that. And so was pretty quick to get on board that church planting train and followed it down the track to Fargo.
Yeah. Okay.
Chris, I'll answer your question regarding why a second time. So after 10 years at Madison Heights, left to help start the Mid-South Church Planting Network. And it was great, wonderful experience. The importance of the network cannot be discussed enough. I think it's critical, particularly in our area of the world, in terms of being a catalyst for church planting. But when you're the coordinator of a church planting network, you spend a lot of time with church planters. And every time that I would come back from visiting with them, I would think to myself, gauge how much I miss it. And could I do this again? And so after doing the network for about 5 years, my wife looked at me one evening and she said, do you ever think about planting another church? And that was the green light. From that moment forward, it wasn't too long until we found ourselves called to plant Trinity.
Now, Collierville and Fargo are a ways apart. So tell us a little bit about the context that you're both in, or just briefly, what makes it unique and different in the context of planting?
Yeah, so the opportunity to come back to my home presbytery was kind of how we ended up in Fargo. Was under care before going off, and our presbytery is Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And North Dakota was the only state left in the country that didn't have a PCA church. And so as I was leaving, I had heard rumblings that they wanted to plant a church in Fargo. And so that was kind of in the back of my mind when Mission North America came to campus. They used to make fun of Fargo and all their meetings, as this destitute place, that nobody would want to go. But to us, my wife and I, we went and visited over a summer while we were doing some internships, and it felt like we were returning home. So, North Dakota is predominantly Lutheran. I call it the land of Lutherans. And to be here, we started from absolutely zero, contacts and from scratch. And, sometimes people call that a parachute plant. And so, that was something that was pretty unique about our context. Our sending church is 3.5 hours south of us. That's about the closest church to us in terms of the PCA. And even in the broader, NAPARC world, there's an OPC church 1.5 hours north and 3 hours west. So pretty isolated, pretty foreign in terms of, Reformed Presbyterian polity or anything like that. And so that meant the first year or so being here was really just meeting people in the community, networking, having people in our homes, lots of cups of coffee, trying to gather that initial group. So those are a few of the unique things about our context. It's also cold.
Really? It's Wisconsin. How cold? It can't be that cold.
We have less trees to block the wind here, too. Okay. It's very windy.
Yeah, that's problematic.
So, Chris, first of all, for your viewers, I want them to know that I've not been smoking cigars for the last 4 hours. I need a new camera on my laptop. I discuss that regularly regarding our podcast, and I just keep forgetting to do it. So apologies. It's just an old laptop. Regarding Collierville, the first church I planted was in the quintessential Bible Belt suburban community and all that entails. And when I came to Collierville, thought that it would be very similar and was quite surprised in how different it is. Memphis is known for barbecue and blues, and it's the southern capital, if you will, of the Delta region in the Deep South. But Collierville is the home of FedEx, World Technology Center. It's also Amazon. It's also UPS, AutoZone. And so we have people that live here and move here from all over the world. We have a fairly large Indian population and a very large Asian population. And so my neighbors are not, and I can say this because I'm a good old boy from Alabama, a lot of them are not good old boys from the Deep South. They are from the Midwest. They are from out West. They are from Florida. They are from Northeast. Really, they're from all over the United States, and they've come here to work for these different companies. And so my experience thus far is it's a mixture of Deep South, Bible Belt, and everywhere else. It's a gumbo, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, so yeah, how did the two? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I'll add a little bit of the context to Fargo. Most people think it's some small town. They've seen the movie. Everything's just snowy, and Fargo is actually the big city of North Dakota. It's about 200,000 people. It's got North Dakota State University, which has a big football program. It's the home to US Bank. We have a Microsoft campus here. It's pretty diverse in terms of its economy. It's fairly large for this region. And for a lot of people that grew up in rural Minnesota, rural North Dakota, they came here for college. This was where they wanted to be. This is where the jobs were. And it's, so in some ways it's a microcosm of kind of the big city dynamic that you might have in a different type of state.
Well, how did the two of you connect then to do this podcast? What was the connection and the thought behind it?
Yeah. Well, I think the genesis of the podcast really came out of the PCA Church Planters Facebook group initially. That was a group we started a few years ago, just to get other church planters together. I had been befriended by a few early on after I received the call to plant, and they just said, we'd like to, bounce ideas off each other and just be friends and connect. And I thought, well, let's try to build that. And so we have, I think, about 400 people in this group now, and not all of them are super active and participating, but it's been a place where, people who have been on the field longer than you or thinking about getting on the field, or there's just common questions that just kind of get recycled through there quite a bit. What do you guys do for your men's group? Hey, we're looking to meet, in a school, or whatever kind of common questions tend to come up, and you get really, really helpful feedback from other planters. And, we closed that group really to people who had passed through church planting assessment, are currently planting or had planted in the past. And there was a growing number of people that were interested in church planting, but weren't, already in the pipeline. And so we started a second group that didn't take off quite as well. It's called Growing Reformed Planters. But really that was kind of the idea with this podcast is, how do we take all of the things and the community of this group and make it available to people who just want to know more about church planting, who are in seminary, maybe they're assistant pastor, maybe they're not even at seminary yet, and they just start curious about what church planting is really like and how you go about doing it. And so Hunter and I connected largely through that. Funny story, we have a shared church member. He used to live down Madison, Mississippi, now lives here in Fargo, North Dakota. And so, we've connected through them as well. But if I'm missing any details, Hunter, be sure to fill it in.
No, not at all. We originally met when I was visiting Covenant Seminary, when I was leading the Mid-South Church Planting Network and was recruiting
That's right.
guys to church plant. And then for me, I joined the forum, the PCA Church Planting Forum. And, one of the things that I say regularly the second time around is to make new mistakes. But also I'm asking new questions. And so I really enjoyed what some of the younger guys were saying and the questions that they were asking and some of the things that they were doing. I found it very interesting. And so John, had the idea for the podcast. I asked if I could join him because I wanted to ask those new questions, but I also wanted to, talk about my past experience and again, just make new mistakes in this process of church multiplication. And that's, I think the Lord brought us together for a reason. It's been, if no one else listens, it has been helpful just for me.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Talk it out loud. It's called 5 Points Church Planting Podcast. There are a lot of other church planting podcasts out there. What is distinctive about this?
Yeah, so we didn't want to make it the PCA Church Planting Podcast. We wanted to be more broad than that, pull in people from other Reformed denominations, Acts 29 kind of leaning folks, and not talk too much inside baseball like maybe we'll do on this this video cast. But yeah, as you go through the church planting world, you get books from Ed Stetzer and, you read Tom Rainer, articles online and all these different church growth model things. And some of that's really, really helpful, but it also just doesn't seem to fit within the framework that we're all committed to as, confessional Reformed Presbyterians. We're kind of weird. So we thought, it would be really helpful to have some of those things maybe reinterpreted through the lens of the PCA's kind of framework, to not have to necessarily just take the quote unquote best practices for church growth or follow some sort of gimmicky, assumptions about marketing and those kind of things. And we all fall prey to that at different times as church planters, I think. But the hope with the podcast was to just be grounded theologically within our camp, and then to talk, how are two guys that are doing it now thinking through these kind of things.
Yeah. It's actually surprising if you look at the landscape of books on church planting, how few there are from a specifically reform perspective. It's almost like we've been banned from the publishing industry, if you will. And so I thought this podcast could be a real help to guys that are not, what I would say, they're not hybrid reformed, but they are very reformed, meaning that they're, creedal and confessional, they're Presbyterian, or, they're reformed. And I think that has been true. And there aren't that many resources out there. Hopefully we can be one, but I've been really surprised by the number of people who have listened that are not reformed. That's caught me off guard, if you will.
Yeah. So what are some of those distinctives that you would, if someone just asked you, so what are the distinctives when it comes to church planting from a confessional or reformed perspective?
Yeah. So John and I did an episode not too long ago called The Essentials of Church Planting, and it was about preaching. And we both, and John, I think it was this episode, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we both had a funny experience with a church marketer that was pushing us in sort of a non-reformed direction. I think he pushed me a little bit more than he did John. And, what I learned from that experience is stay true to your roots, understand who you are, understand, your denominational heritage. And so it was just funny that we kind of had a very similar experience. And so preaching would be a good example that, I think preaching from the Reformed perspective, the Reformed tradition looks different in other places. And that's because we are, we stand upon those creeds and those confessions and of course scripture as well. And so it guides us in the way that we preach. And then also I would say that in our tradition, we typically tend to be expository in terms of our preaching. And if you visit non-reformed church plants, they tend to operate in a different fashion. And so that's just one small example.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember going to a church planting network meeting, and I went to a breakout session. This was not in the PCA, and it was all about, elder recruitment and, how to choose elders and how to train them. And it really was just this one guy's thoughts. And you could do whatever you want. And honestly, some of his thoughts weren't very good, very good. And I thought to myself, we got this big blue book called the Book of Church Order. It's kind of got it all sorted for us. And so, one of the great things about, planting a Reformed church is some of those things that, we've taken for granted are incredibly helpful. I mean, I always tell people, I talk nothing more regularly than ecclesiology. What is the church? And even the idea of what's our telos, our goal, our mission. It's not that we're doing big tent revival meetings, looking for decisions for Christ. Of course, we're doing outreach and hoping to see people come to faith, but ultimately we're trying to build a worshiping community, right? Where Christ is worshiped each week. We have a very high view of the sacraments and preaching and all those kind of things. And so I think it even shapes, the approach to what it looks like to grow a church, where you're trying to lead people towards. And so those are just a few things that kind of come to mind.
Yeah. Yeah, Chris, when I was in the first church that I planted before I actually left to do it, the pastor of the mother church told me to take 6 months and visit all of the different churches in our community. And as someone who had grown up in the PCA, and really my only other experience outside of our denomination was Baptist, it was very eye-opening. I did not really know what it was like in other places. And so as I was going to plant, went to one of those conferences that everybody tries to go to. This is where I'm going to learn all the golden nuggets. This is going to help me plant this church. And I remember coming out of that conference thinking they really didn't talk about preaching. They really didn't talk about the sacraments. Prayer was barely mentioned, and fellowship. And it was all 101 ways to start your church, very gimmicky. And so the second time around and thinking through this podcast, it's how can we be a greater resource to guys that are reformed, that are doing this for the first time, and people who are just grasping for straws like I was so many years ago that might be listening as well that aren't reformed.
Yeah, no, I for many of us, or we're in the midst of listening to also another podcast, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which again, as a church planter, looking at that and saying it's scary. I've likened it to it's kind of Tiger King for evangelicals, if you will. And what's so frightening with it is, man, that could be any of us. And at the same time going, I appreciate the structures that we have. Doesn't mean we always stay between the white lines like we should, but when we step out, it's a lot more clear that there's a problem. And then looking at it at our own, but when I listen to it, looking at my own heart and going, wow, this is that kind of narcissism can be true of all of us. And so, well, great. Well, you've done 27 podcasts this year. You've spoken to a variety of leaders in planting. You talk about fundraising, church planter wives, planting in England and Canada. What are the surprises that you've seen as you have your own experience, but now you're gathering others, and so what's standing out for you?
Yeah, as we got going, right, we had in mind potential church planters, current church planters, and as we've kind of interacted with some of our audience members, I really began to realize that a lot of what we've been talking about, especially in light of kind of the COVID mix-up of things, is it's not unique or novel to church planting, right? And so I think there's principles that we're trying to follow that aren't, you just do this for 3 years until your church is particularized, and then you get on this other path. But instead, the topics we're talking about, and I hope the methodology that we're trying to promote is just good church work, right? Like could be helpful and encouraging to any pastor that wants to tune in, to think, as we restart our church after COVID, those are the questions church planters are asking all the time. And so I think they do have this maybe unique opportunity to be able to be a voice to those who are thinking through those questions now, maybe for the first time in a while. And so that's kind of been surprising to me. I mean, we've had a lot of guests on who weren't church planters, but they certainly have helpful insights, and it's just from their own pastoral ministry. And that's what we need. We need voices from outside, even in our little echo chamber of church planters. Maybe we can get too caught up in little things, and somebody from outside can be a helpful voice. So.
Yeah, I think what I've learned from the podcast thus far is that church planting is a very encouraging, as hard as it is for church planters to plant a church. When we begin to talk to other church planters, it's a very an arena of encouragement. Church planters are in it together, and there's a really strong fellowship, and there's really strong community. You don't see, and I think John would agree with this, you don't see some of the bickering that happens on bigger levels of ecclesiological life. And so, going through this pandemic and going through COVID, I've just really come away very encouraged by all the different church planters that we have talked to, and not meaning that their church plan is going great, but I think because you're in the fire planting a church during a global pandemic, that you don't have time to argue about certain things. And so it's as if you have your arms around each other. And so it's been a unbelievable support for me over the past year doing this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. It's kind of reminds me of an international church in another city where there could be a lot of theological perspectives, perhaps, but you're just glad there's someone there,
right? Yeah,
doing the work. And I mean, for me, I planted 30 years ago, and then pastored for 26 after that. I just love church planters. I love being around church planters. There's an excitement, there's an enthusiasm, and there's an interest in majoring on what is most critical.
Yeah.
That's great.
There's some theological question when it comes to whether or not you should live stream your service, but there's not very much theology in which camera is best. And so those are the kind of questions that church planters, when we're getting together, it's a lot of times it's just, what are you doing for this? How big of a trailer did you buy? Just
Yeah.
some of that stuff. It's just so helpful to have that collegiality. There's an innate, bond between church planners, knowing that we're all kind of wrestling through the same things at the same time. So,
though I will say I'm jealous of your podcast, Mike. I'm working with this little thing here, and man, you've got an operation going there. That's great. We have a question. Kobe Dick asks, have you done written cliff notes of your podcast? So you have your podcast, do you have any show notes or anything that go along with those?
No, we're church planners. We don't have time. I think that's the answer.
And there's a level of administrative skill that goes along with that I've historically found don't usually go along with church planters. Okay. He also then asked, I'm an RE about to be a provisional elder for a plant. So I take it, Kobe, okay, so you're a ruling elder in an established church, but now you're going to be helping oversee a church plant. And I'm going to guess here, you don't have a background in church planting, perhaps. What tips do you have for what would be most benefits the planter from REs? What tips do you have for what most benefits the planter from the REs?
Yeah, I would say most church planters have, an entrepreneurial spirit where they don't want to be micromanaged. And so if you fall into that too much, then you just have no input from your elders and your oversight. And that's equally as bad. So being involved in a way that's encouraging and available and checking in and, it's pretty easy to forget to schedule an oversight meeting if you're the church planter. So taking leadership of that kind of things, and then really just, investing and showing your care for the church planter. I think, sometimes I think ruling elders feel like they don't have, the pastor background to contribute to some things. But honestly, I feel like they're probably the most helpful voice. They're the people that are, working the ordinary job and living out ministry. And so I can have these optimistic ideals for what I think somebody in my church should be doing, because my life is, 24/7 ministry. And to have a ruling elder just kind of help ground me in real life, I think is an invaluable resource as a church planner.
Yeah, Chris, I had one ruling elder in particular that they could write a book on how to be a ruling elder in a church plant based on this guy. And I would have not made it had it not been for him. And he looked at the church plant on a continuum of 1 through 10. 1 would be, this guy no longer believes in the Trinity. 10 would be, are we going to serve water or Kool-Aid to the kids during children's church? And, he said, I will step in if it's a 1 through 3. The rest, you know how to handle. And so what I'm going to do is spend my time encouraging you, praying for you, supporting you, loving on you and your family. And he did that. And so church planting can be very isolating at times. People see you as their pastor, not necessarily their friend or their closest friend. And he just put his arm around me and walked with me the entire way. And I think in a church plant setting, that is because of the strains and stresses of church planting. I think that's critical and essential.
Yeah.
Yeah. And don't discount just being present. 3 more people on a Sunday, you bring your wife and one of your kids. That's an encouragement. You're not necessarily doing anything except for being there and maybe, grabbing lunch after service or something. But those things really matter.
And that can be the hard part for a provisional session if they have no experiential, eyes on the ground to be able to say, hey, you're doing great, really encourage you. If it's merely on that monthly kind of meeting, unlike the elders you'll have later, they know the people.
Right. Chris, I'm sorry, I was talking about an elder that was not provisional, but I will say that I have an elder now who is provisional. And, there's a distance between us. He's not in the Memphis area, but in terms of calling and texting to just say, how are you? What's going on? like he cares.
Mhm.
And I know every Saturday night I get a text from him saying how he prayed for me, and very specifically how he prayed for me, not just, hey, praying for you guys up in Carterville. I think that is because church planners tend to be lone rangers at times. I think as a provisional elder on a borrowed session, it's doing your best to maintain supportive contact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. And I appreciate what you said too about knowing, and sometimes it can be hard, understanding the context of church planting, what really are the majors that have to be done and taken care of. And so if you're coming in from an established church context, that a healthy church should have these programs, but a church plant cannot, but that doesn't mean they're going to have a Sunday school program, or they're not going to, have all this stuff. To know, you said the 1 through 3, that is what you have to figure out. What are the hills that you really need to watch over?
Right. Yeah.
His third question was, what are your thoughts on outsourcing some of the administrative stuff to something like Auxilio? Now, that's a softball question because you're sponsored by Auxilio. So here you go.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts as far as something like that? Outsourcing?
Yeah, I would assume that most pastors don't have a high level of, desire to do the financial, management of a church,
Mm-hmm.
and probably don't have the resources to have somebody locally in their church do those things. Now, some people, have a proclivity towards that, or somebody's volunteering, or your oversight, or your mother church might handle some of those things. But, anything you can get off your plate as a church planter, the better. I've been talking to some other planters lately, and they asked a question about, getting a youth group going. I said, my default rule now that I never followed early on was give everything away that you can as fast as you can, and provide support and all that along the way. But yeah, Auxilio is this one of many great companies that, they will literally do a professional job following all of your financial things, reconciling your expenses, making sure that all you're above reproach and how the finances are going in your church. If people have questions, there's reports to go to and all those kind of things. And so, you don't have to hire a full-time or part-time administrator to do those kind of things. And these people work with churches, and churches are so unique, and church payroll is so unique. And so to have somebody that specifically focuses in on churches like Auxilio is certainly a blessing and a resource I would encourage people to consider.
I threw up in the chat box the link to Auxilio. It's great. A great work. We do encourage planters to make good use of it. Don't try to take it on yourself. And we'll be doing a webcast with them, talking a little bit more about what's involved with Auxilio. That's great. Ben Cinder asked, what have been some good gathering strategies for church planters that you have heard of or used during the pandemic? So it's easy, to think, well, I heard this worked, and back in the old days in 2019, we're at a different context. So you've got in Ben a guy who launched public worship in October of 20, and is moving along. But what are some of the things you've heard go on, or maybe you've done yourself?
Well, I would just say that probably something I've learned maybe the hard way within the last year is that the reason people will come to a church or stay in a church or not come to a church because it exists somewhere else is really the aspect of community. There's going to be some hardcore Reformed people that really need, they're looking for the church that's expository preaching and, all the things. But at the end of the day, if you want to reach, gather, meet new people and really have them stick, finding avenues for community. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't probably shouldn't be on some level like a church event, right? What do your people want to do? And then how do you bolster them and come alongside and make it into a place where, a few of the families in your church are there and they're able to invite people, and it's not this awkward, church event, but you're just going to the local hockey game, or, okay, that's North Dakota, but whatever it is in your context, the county fair, just even like round robin kind of dinner meals where you're having dinner clubs and you're meeting up at a restaurant once a month, and you're getting to know each other. And those kind of things, to me, as I've been talking to people, that's really where you see new relationships formed, where you see people, once they connect with one another, and those people are already connected into your church, it's a natural outflow for them to start showing up to other things that are more church specific. And of course, you get a couple Presbyterians together, they can't help but talk about, theology or whatever else might come along. So that's something I've learned, that community is really a big engine behind outreach, because everything else just kind of comes across as superficial or gimmicky. And there's only a certain amount of people that are going to show up to a church specific event, in terms of, a Bible study or a seminar on some sort of, type of theological content or something. So just taking some of the pressure off that you have to have a strong amount of content, and instead maybe doing 90% community, 10% content on some of your events.
Yeah. So Chris, we started 6 months before COVID hit. And when the quarantine started, I just began to talk to our group about that fellowship is Jesus is the cornerstone of a church plant. Community of fellowship is the bedrock, and that we have to get to know each other. We have to become close friends. We have to understand, what a church plant is for, the mission and the vision. And so we just really doubled down on fellowship. And that has been, it's what I did in the first church plant. And I think that the seeds of fellowship produce the harvest of outreach. And so that's what we're doing now. We haven't launched. We will probably do that around December. And we may do a few events after we launch. But I think the main thing is getting your group to think about what it means to reach out to their friends and neighbors and their co-workers, because they like each other and they like the church plant and they believe in what you're doing. And I think that's the recipe for success. And then as a church planter, during COVID, it's sort of a Hansel and Gretel approach, is dropping breadcrumbs everywhere you go. So I'm just constantly dropping those breadcrumbs through social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, community pages on Facebook. I'm talking to people when I'm out in the community. I think there is an on-ramp to people visiting your church that's quite long. And so every single step of the way, you have to talk about the church plant in order to see any results from that down the road, over and over and over again.
That's good. Yeah, I think it was Andy Crouch who had said that care is the new apologetic. And somewhat what I'm hearing. Again, in our Reformed context, you brought up one of our wonderful distinctives and a benefit, not trying to demean it, is if you think of the threefold office, is the prophetic aspect. It's the preaching. We are, especially within our circles, we're verbivores. We love words and we love talking. In some church contexts, it might be more the kingly office, more administrative program structures to help the church. In the context of especially in a COVID world, that priestly office can be easily, I think, missed, of how are we showing care and being that, the go-between for people to help them to see what in a real tangible way who God is, because it's somewhat outside of our normal box. Not that the box is wrong, but in the context of COVID, we have to think in some innovative ways how to bring the word specifically in those ways.
Yeah, Chris, I saw that really before COVID with my mentor in ministry, and he's now in glory, but preaching was not his strength, and I think that's a fair thing to say, and he would admit it. But he was a shepherd par excellence, and I watched people in my hometown and people in Jackson, Mississippi. They loved him because of his ability to shepherd, and they came to the church and loved the church because they knew that he cared about him. And I heard story after story of unchurched and dechurched people. And again, this was in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, when nobody was talking about unchurched, dechurched. and how they would talk about him visiting in their home and dropping by to see them and coming to see where they worked. And time again, the stories were for me that I've heard and still hear. I thought preachers just preached on Sunday, and you never saw them Monday through Friday. And it honestly was sad, the number of stories I've heard over the years of pastors who just don't shepherd well. They don't do outreach well. And he did. And I saw how that helped build the church. And so, I think sometimes we promote a model in church planning that is the entrepreneurial cowboy who's the great speaker. And I don't think that is necessarily always true. And so in COVID, thinking back to Bill, it was a great reminder of how he built 3 churches based on just simply going out there and loving people.
Yeah, no, it's the old unfortunate joke of pastors are very much bear the image of God. They are invisible 6 days a week and incomprehensible on the 7th. And so, yeah, how we engage really makes a big difference. It's maybe just thinking about, again, the context in which we're at right now. Listening to something, another evangelical leader, two in a row in these questions, Ed Stetzer, he's a missiologist, church planning guru. I heard him recently say that from what he has seen or studies, he has seen that pastors are less emotionally healthy than the general population, and church planters make pastors look really stable. Or to put it another way, even with some of that bit of that wry humor, but what is very true is if anyone entering ministry with a degree of resiliency, as they've come through now 18 months later, they're not in as good of a place than they were before. We're not healthier than we were before. If we entered into ministry at any sort of deficit, it's only gotten worse. So with that in mind, what are you seeing about the health of church planters? Cody mentioned as well what John Metlock is doing with RBI to help REs support pastors and their wives. And so there are some mechanisms in place. But what are you seeing happening, and the need, and how is it being addressed, or how should it be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I can feel that. So I think that you're preaching to me, Chris. Come on, keep it going. So how it's being addressed, I'm not exactly sure I have a go-to answer. There are increasingly a good amount of resources out there that I would assume most people know about in the PCA. I hope they do. RBI, you mentioned, I was doing something with REs, but they provide, scholarships for counseling. Pericaleo's got support for pastors' wives. There's resources out there. It took me a year to become humble enough to realize I needed a coach. And so, so I hired really my mentor as somebody I could check in with regularly and be honest with and get his encouragement and support. And so, coaching is certainly one of the things that you're encouraged to do right away as you get into church planting. And so I think there's been a good surge of those resources in the PCA lately in the past couple of years. I think that the research that's been done through books like Resilient Ministry and those kind of things have borne fruit into actual tangible resources that are now available to any pastor.
Yeah, Chris. So I would agree with John. Excuse my dog in the background. That's Twix. I would agree with John about coaching. I did not have a coach my first time around. And so the second time around, you would think, well, you certainly don't need a coach, but I do. And I have one, and it is very important. I think secondly would be helping your future elders understand the difference in time between being a pastor and being a businessman. And so 4 weeks vacation doesn't mean that much to me, honestly. I need regular periods of rest, because even though I try to take Monday off, I end up working a little bit every single day of the week. And no matter how hard I try, it's virtually impossible to take a full day off. And I'm pretty, fairly undiagnosed OCD and organized and still find it extremely challenging. I work a little bit every single day of the week. And so not having family that lives near me, weekends mean more to me than weeks of vacation. And I think that's hard sometimes for ruling elders to understand this, that my family can't come see me because they work during the week and I work, during the weekend. And so over the last however many years, it's been hard for me to see my parents who are 5 hours away, a brother who's 8 hours away, another brother who's 5 hours away. And so weekends off mean a lot more to me than 4 weeks of just, the standard 4 weeks of vacation. I would say to ruling elders in terms of loving and supporting your church planter, you've got to think through his calling, his benefits, everything differently than you would your own profession. It's just different. And so that time is important to keep mentally sane as a church planter and a pastor. I don't feel comfortable speaking into this as at an established church, to be completely honest, but in a church planting situation, you need to be out of the pulpit on a regular basis. You may be in church and worship, but that means that week you were freed up to do some other things that you probably have gotten behind on as a planter. And so I would say coaching, I would say understanding the vitality and significance of time. And then I think the third thing would be making sure that your wife is supported and to make sure that she is all right and that she is okay. Because I would say my spiritual health and my mental health has more to do with my wife than anything, to be honest. And, I'd not been a pastor for 5 years before we went to plant. So I was re-energized and refreshed, and it was almost like a sabbatical, if you will, and prepared me for this second plant. Leading the network was challenging and it was busy, but it wasn't like being a church planter.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those things there. One, just the necessity of a coach. And again, we don't have the teeth to mandate, but we so strongly encourage. But yeah, that is one of those things again and again, saying get a coach. And it's, again, not just for church planters. I think all of us ongoing need a coach. 2 weeks, Vinny Torello and Charles Hooper were doing a webcast with them talking about coaches for pastors, and talking about the importance of that. The other thing that I would just, my board would yell at me for not mentioning, because it's on the front, is next gen, but of these aspects of having mentored cohorts, of guys working together through what you had mentioned, resilient ministry, those 6 soft skill of spiritual formation, soul care, emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, leadership, marriage, and family. That's where we fail, all of us. We don't fail because of not knowing enough scripture or not having our theology down pat just right. We fail because we're not attending to those core issues and being part of those. And so I know, Hunter, down your way, there are a number of in the Mid-South network now, there are a number of next gen cohorts for guys starting in seminary, but guys who are been in ministry for years. I had the opportunity to have lunch with a bunch of guys in just outside of Chattanooga last week that have been a renewal cohort now for almost 3 years. And it's just, the one guy said, I don't think I'd be in ministry if I wasn't getting this kind of engagement. So,
yeah.
And COVID has just made it worse.
Chris, when I was planning the first time, there was 5 other church plants going on in Jackson. They weren't Presbyterian or Reformed, and I just felt alone. And somebody mentioned a guy named Murray Lee in Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm from Alabama, so Murray and I started talking to each other, and it was really, pre-PCA church planting Facebook group. It was just Murray and I calling each other and bouncing ideas off each other. And I just remember thinking at that time, goodness, it would be so good to have a group of church planters that thought similar to myself, and theologically, ecclesiologically, to be able to talk to. And I think in part because of social media, not everybody lives in Metro Atlanta.
Yeah.
So I think because of social media and communication abilities that now is taking off more. And it's great to see through such things as Next Gen, just guys there for each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is critical.
Yeah, and I think there's different avenues for that. Of course, I think the structure of something like Next Gen is probably makes it that much more beneficial. But even a lifeline, for me is you just find the people that you're going to connect with. They're going to be in your, our denomination has little camps. You're going to find a couple of guys in your camp, and you're going to start a text thread or whatever it is, and that's going to be just a real source of life. You mentioned Murray Lee. I was going to bring that up later. That they have this program where they bring people in from all around the country to get some training in their first year of planting. I mean, now you have 10 guys that are the exact same stage as you in different contexts where you're able to just, continue to interact and support one another and you build that bond. I could see how, Next Gen having some curriculum to go along with that, some real intentionality, not just, informal conversation along the way, but to really work through some things, being just an added bonus to those. Because, even the informal things have been super helpful for me.
Yeah. Oh. So we got about 10 minutes left. Let's just think a bit as you've been talking with people involved with planting and other things. What are the trends that you're seeing? The good, the bad, the ugly. And again, if they're ugly or bad, we don't, not just to down on what else is happening, but what are the warning things you should be looking at, and what are some of the things that are exciting you? Even in the context of what's been a difficult last year and a half, that's been really encouraging.
Well, it seems like all the seminaries have kind of caught up with the need for church planters and have really taken an aggressive approach to start church planting tracks and have, even M&A having, assessments in different areas and just, getting that ball rolling a little earlier and thinking through the unique aspects as somebody's thinking about church planting and trying to help prepare them for that. So I think that's an encouraging thing. We've interviewed a few of the different seminary guys who are leading those. And so, that's certainly a step in the right direction, I think, because right now what the biggest bottleneck in church planting is candidates, right? There are, I believe it's 7 opportunities for planting for every 1 church planter. So yeah, that's a real problem. And we'd love to see, church planting continue to grow, more people to plant, and people who don't think that they can plant realize that, not every plant's the same. And so having more conversations about that, I think will only help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with John. The good is you're seeing a lot. I laughed and joked about the publishing industry seems to have boxed out reform folks, but I think, John's onto something there. You see seminaries taking a greater interest in church planting. 2 years ago, I did a study, maybe 3 years ago when I was with the network, I did a study on church planting in seminaries, and it was an empty bottle for the most part. And now you see some of the seminaries taking a greater interest in this. And I think they understand, well, it's good for their own business model, if you will, because they're beginning to understand the number of people who are unchurched and de-churched, the number of churches that are closing in the United States, and that, if we don't plant churches, seminaries will dry up because they produce pastors who pastor churches. And so you're seeing even places like Birmingham Theological Seminary, they're now offering I think it's a doctorate for church multiplication leaders. They're saying, hey, come learn more in order to help multiply churches, in your presbytery or in your church, be a mother church. And so I really like that, what I'm seeing in terms of seminaries taking a more active role in saying we need to support church multiplication, not only because it's biblical, and it is, but it's practical. And then I would say, that's the good. I think I'm seeing, more resources. You're seeing podcasts, you're seeing webinars. There's just so much more out there than when I first went to plant in 2005, it was just, hey, grab a few of Ed Stetzer's books and find somebody that's planted a church before you. And I really appreciate the dearth of information that seems to be out there. That's the good. The bad, I think, would be that we just don't have enough church planters. I agree with John on that completely. There's just not enough guys. And I think one of the benefits of the podcast, one of the things I've enjoyed, is to be able to talk to pastors through the podcast and say, hey, it's not as difficult as you think. It's not as challenging as you think, and you can overcome your fears of raising support. So pray about and consider church planting in the future. I think that's something that's been really good for my heart. The ugly would be, and I've talked about this with several church planters that are second time around, even some guys who have done it for three times. We have a tendency in Reformed circles to, we've been to seminary for 50 years, and then we spend another 10 years trying to get ordained. And it just seems like this long, exhaustive process, and it's very educationally centric. And, we come out and we pride ourselves in what all we know. I'm seeing Reform guys go into planning, and their attitude is, I've just got this figured out because I've been to college, I've been to seminary, I've had a church planning class, I'm ordained. And I'm just seeing more and more of this. I've got this figured out. I don't need help. They're not asking the amount of questions that they need to be asking. And so the flip side of this, and I've seen this from doing the podcast, the guys that are asking questions are the non-Reform guys, because they don't necessarily have seminary. They didn't have the church planning class. They don't have the long ordination process. There's not as much there for them. And they're the ones that I'm getting texts and phone calls and emails, like, help me understand this. And so as I'm watching guys leave their church plants, some of them, I just want to say, we all collectively, whether it's first time, second time, or third time, we've got to be asking each other questions. This is a continual learning process that never stops. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's the ugly, good, bad, and ugly. That's some of the ugly that I've seen lately. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, yeah. Thank you. So much. I just got a few minutes here. If you're able to do it very quickly, you are now in charge. You have absolute control of church planting and all church planters. So what you say goes. You can set the term and the conditions moving forward. What do you want to see happen in the next 10 years? Each give me one thing.
Yeah, I feel like because of the shortage of church planters, we kind of just grab willing bodies and send them out as fast as we can. And I look around some other denominations like the OPC, and it's always like a retired pastor planting the church. Or it's always this guy who's been in ministry, someone like you, Chris, it's been in ministry for 30 years.
But right from retired old guy to me.
But in some ways, it would be, I think, would serve the kingdom so much better to have the cream of the crop kind of people recruited intentionally to be on the front lines of this stuff. I don't know how to make that happen, but I just called Tim Keller and said, you got to plant another church. I call, Sean Michael Lucas and tell me he's got to plant another church, whatever, all these guys. Right. Because in many ways it's kind of this, people say it's the front edge of the, the church mission and all that, but yeah, we need to put our best people in the front. And so I would love to see a shift from just young, excited, zealous people, kind of like I was coming in, and instead also see an influx of guys, coming out of the senior pastorate to go plant another church.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, Hunter?
That's a hard one. I think that much control and authority would be dangerous, and I would,
especially if we give it to you. We know that, but we're going for it anyway
in 5 or 10 minutes. But I think that collectively as a denomination, and this might be a tad bit controversial, but I think that, could that help your ratings or your webinar? we need to realize it's 2021 and it's not 1973. And we have, and it's only because I've been studying the numbers for the last couple of years for research purposes. We have a serious issue in this country in terms of the unchurched, the churched, millennials leaving the faith, the number of churches that are closing, the growth of the population of the United States. We are trending very quickly towards Western Europe. I've even read some of the research articles from the Journal of Science and Religion. This just, and these are guys, many of these reports are coming from guys that we would call progressive scholars, and they are sounding major alarms about where the United States is headed in the next 10 to 15 years. And so we have this very difficult model in order for someone to be ordained and to become a pastor. And I think, I don't know what the answer to this is, but if I was put in charge, some kind of exception for guys in church planting to help on-ramp them faster and quicker to the ministry and into church planting situations in order to plant churches. Now, I don't think, they should, without little experience, they should be sent out to plant a church, but to help them help a church planter and then to be sent out to multiply. Yeah. We've got to figure this out, or we're going to be, in some sense, like the Baptists and Methodists as they spread across the frontier, and we went back to Europe to study. And, why are there very few Presbyterian churches across the Mississippi River? Well, that's part of it. And we've got to rethink that, or think through that more carefully and biblically, in my opinion.
No, thanks. It's interesting. Both of you are coming from, in a way, you stated what could seem very opposite, but if we pull those together, getting more experienced, seasoned guys, and getting those that are not going to be our typical pathway to planting, whether it's team or mentoring or coaching. I think because the key really is, it's not just starting new churches, it's having healthy churches. Because starting them is one thing, maintaining and ongoing, that's really where it becomes very difficult.
Yeah. Church planting is not the most effective way to reach people. Is church multiplication of spiritually healthy churches is the most effective way to reach people who are not in church.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and appreciate those who joined with us. We'll be back in 2 weeks talking about coaching pastors with Vinny, who heads up M&A's coaching. He's our coaching coordinator. And then 2 weeks after that, on the 29th, we'll be talking about how to move from founding pastor to successor pastor with Chris Polsky, who just did some work on that. And some interesting findings and opportunities for more conversation. Well, until later, thank you so much. I appreciate our time together on M&A Conversations. Lord bless.